zum zweiten Anlass der Ausstellung zum Backstein, zur Backstein-Themenausstellung Brick'18, sozusagen der Schlussvortrag. Sie haben aber noch eine Woche Zeit, diese schöne Ausstellung anzuschauen, falls Sie noch nicht die Zeit dazu gefunden haben. Die ist bis am nächsten Freitag, 20. September, wird die noch hier stehen. Und ich möchte mich eigentlich an dieser Stelle vor allem bei ZZ Wancor noch bedanken für diese schöne Ausstellung, die Sie konzipiert haben und aufgestellt haben, insbesondere Patrick Alexander, dem ich jetzt auch das Wort übergebe.
Ja, guten Abend und herzlich willkommen auch im Namen von ZZ Wancor. Es freut mich sehr, halt die Ausstellung hier zeigen zu dürfen. Der Brick Award wird von der Muttergruppe, der Wienerberger Gruppe, ausgetragen alle 2 Jahre. Und wir dachten uns jetzt zur letzten Ausgabe, es ist schade bei all diesen Inhalten, die zusammenkommen, wenn die einfach irgendwie in diesem Buch landen und dann dort verweilen. Man könnte das ja im Prinzip auch noch weiter nach außen tragen und etwas Tolles draus machen, was wir jetzt getan haben. Ebenfalls herzlich willkommen heißen möchte ich Job Flores vom Rotterdamer Büro Monadnock. Ich denke, die meisten von Ihnen, die Monadnock kennen und dies nicht über einen persönlichen Kontakt, hatten den ersten Berührungspunkt mit diesen wahnsinnig tollen Visualisierungen, für die Sie irgendwie einfach bekannt sind. Und weiter sehr interessant ist die Bandbreite an Projekten und Tätigkeiten, die sie abbilden. Also es reicht irgendwie von städtebaulichen Themen über Industriehallen, Wohnungsbau bis hin zu künstlerischen Interventionen. Und irgendwie das, was alle diese Projekte gemeinsam haben, ist immer dieser sehr starke visuelle Ausdruck, sehr grafisch, zum Teil schon typografisch. Und das war mit auch Grund dafür, dass Monadnock mit dem Atlashaus den Brick Award in der Kategorie Feeling at Home gewinnen konnte. Und über das Atlashaus und ich denke auch weitere Projekte wird jetzt Job Flores Auskunft, Einblick in ihre Tätigkeit geben. So. Herzliches Willkommen an Job Flores.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction, Patrick. Thank you for inviting me here at the Bouwmoestencentrale at this venue. This is the first time being here in this special place with a beautiful library. I'm going to talk about 3 projects today. Before talking about these 3 projects, I would like to, well, I have to do this within approximately an hour. And I think the 3 projects are, to a certain extent, brick projects, and I will be focusing also on this material. I will try to make you part of our considerations and reflections when it comes to the usage of this material. I will speak of the Atlas House in Eindhoven, in the Netherlands, and not so far away from there is the Landmark Building in New Bergen. And I will finish with a larger project, the Park Pavilion in Otterlo, which is also located in the east of the Netherlands. But please allow me first to briefly contextualize what I'm going to show you. When giving a lecture, it is a bit of a habit to start off with a short explanation of our name of the office. Particularly in the context of tonight, it is adequate, I think. This is our location, this is our office. We are located here on the top floor in an old warehouse. And our name, Monadnock, is derived from this building in Chicago. The word Monadnock stands for a type of mountain, we found this out after visiting this beautiful building and falling in love with it. And when we had our first encounter, we thought this building stands for a lot of things we find interesting. It is by accident also a brick building. It was actually realized by two pairs of architects over a period of approximately 15 years, and it was built in steel and in brick, and it carries one name, Monadnock. And we are personally in favor of this brick part, the oldest part. Why? Because because of the specific technique that is being used of decoration, you could say. This architect, or this part of the building, was designed by John Wellborn Root, and he was not referring to classical Greek architecture. Instead, he studied Egyptian architecture, and I think that's resonating in this piece of work. Now, for example, you see the edge of the building, which is sharp here, and then over 17 floors, going over into a rounded edge. I think that's quite beautiful. And what I learned from this is that Root has specifically chosen not to use additional decorations, because all refinements in this block come out of the masonry itself, like a piece of clay, you could say. He seems to have modeled the block into the right shape, allowing himself no other additive materials for making characteristic and a tangible building. Look at the belly here of the building, bulging out, also in brick. Beautiful, thick plinth. And the consequence of such a thick, massive plinth is a very deep window relief. And another thing is the plasticity of the bay windows. And they are not sharp, but they are also rounded, with rounded corners and rounded edges. Therefore, they're very elegantly bulging out of the surface of the facade. And I think these rounded bricks are quite special because they're not doing this only, but here they go into two directions in the bottom. Here you see the drawing. And I think it's a very specific treatment of masonry. Root used bricks with a lot of smooth plasticity, specifically charging moments in the building with a high tension in the straight surface. So actually he disturbed a bit the tranquility of the surface and the repetition. And I think he was very much aware of these moments, like you can see in the earlier corner here. Now, we're going to make a jump to the Netherlands. We're getting closer to where I am from, the flat and low countries. And we are based in a river delta, and we have a clay culture as well. And I would like to elaborate a bit on what happened in the past, in the recent past, when you could say when international modernism arrived in the Netherlands. Many architects fiercely embraced this novelty, and they were rapidly forgetting about this clay culture, you could say, being seduced by the abstraction and the lightness of modernism and functionalism. And it was very clear that brick was out of fashion for these architects, and their very effective publicity machine of modernism also overruled other voices, like the voice of architects that were more in favor of continuity, like the one you see here, Ad van der Steur, a Rotterdam-based architect. He was the architect of the museum Boijmans van Beuningen, but also of many other buildings in the city. And today these buildings are still around. They are still here. And having a practice in Rotterdam, these buildings have continuously inspired us. And also, important to mention, for different reasons over time, for different aspects over time. In the beginning, we liked them very much because of their massivity and coherence and brutality. But recently, it gradually changed. I would now say that these buildings make use of a completely different type of vocabulary than modernism. You could say they're more beaux-arts in their language. And I would say that this vocabulary is much more eclectic and diverse, or less dogmatic. I would even say free and playful. And besides being a brick building, these buildings also want to be part of the city. They want to make city. They want to make streets. That's what we find very attractive. And that brings us to also, I would say, to the nascence of our thinking, the architecture of the city. In the beginning of our practice, this was a quite literal element, with heavy buildings forming streets and urbanity. I would say to a certain extent this is still valid, but nowadays we have also understood this in a much broader sense. We have understood that simultaneously one is able to make exceptions, making architecture which is more perhaps ambiguous or double-sided, or that something big could also represent something small, and something small could also represent something big, or something could be coherent and simultaneously be assembled. Having said that, now I'm going to the first project. This is the landmark building in New Bergen. It's in the south of the Netherlands, the southeast, close to the German and Belgian border. You can see here. This building was realized in 2013, and it's along the river Maas. It's in a so-called new town, a small village. And here's the current situation, but you have to imagine that this square was a parking lot. This whole village was realized in the 60s, and the priority was for the car. So not a cozy market square, no, it was a parking lot with shops around it. The old village, Bergen, so not New Bergen, was here. And there was a small competition, and the competition required only one thing, a landmark. This was quite puzzling for us because, of course, we asked the organizers of the competition whether there were more requirements, and there were not. So we proposed a sort of bar underneath, hoping that this would become more than only a landmark. And we also figured out why it was so important to have a landmark. Well, because this new town needed an identity, but also all the surrounding villages had their old church, authentic church tower. And these church towers were visible from the horizon. And this new town didn't have such a thing. So they wanted to implement a new identity in their small center. The project developer proposed this volume with apartments and new shops, and this would become a new market square. And on the beginning of the market square, there would be the landmark as a pivoting point in the center. Well, this is what we saw. It's not because of the snow, but it was really quite depressing. We started off by studying on, let's say, vertical volumes and also ingredients we found in the surroundings. There's a former coal industry, charcoal industry in the south of the Netherlands, and there were a lot of industrial structures which were seeking verticality, you could say. So what we do, we make collections of examples, and then we try to learn from these examples. Later on in the project, it turned out that these vertical structures were not the only, you could say, ingredients. But also we found out that if you make an important building on such a location, or let's say if you make a building on such a location, it automatically becomes important because it's central and it's visible from all sides. We understood that it should have more than only being a landmark, being a vertical building. The typical thing about this building is that it had no real program, so a landmark only meant that it was visible from far away, but also that it was accessible for people to walk all the way to the top and have a look over the surroundings. So a scenic view. And it actually was raising the question, what type of building should we make here? What is the character? What is the right typology for this building? And we found out that on old Dutch, but also I think Flemish and German market squares, you have a certain, let's say, regular amount of program that you find everywhere. So most of the time the town hall, most of the time also a building which is called a wage building for trade. And these buildings are quite typical buildings. They have strange proportions. They're very narrow and very high. And they're very richly decorated with natural stone. And most of the time they're also detached, so freestanding and approachable and visible from all sides. And they are non-religious. They are indeed civic, because they're part of the collective of the municipality, accessible for all people. So we thought, well, let's steal this typology, or use it and recycle it as a motive for the landmark building. In order to make, let's say, a small house that would fit to the scale of the market, and then on top of that we would place a tower which would be visible from far away. So we did this proposal. And this is the scheme of the proposal. It's a square plan, and it contains 2 towers. There's quite a long story attached to that, which I'm not going to tell right now. But the reason to make 2 towers is also that we had to insulate, of course, the building. And we thought if we make a small tower first on the first level, then you insulate this tower and are not insulating this tower, the highest one. And that means that you access the balcony here. And from this balcony, you can have a look over the market square. And then you access the higher tower, walk all the way up, and then you have a view over the landscape. That's what we learned from old fortresses that also have these small access towers on their own tower. This is an axonometric, and here, this is not a rendering, but a picture. Of course, I've only elaborated now on a very practical thing about the 2 towers, but what we were also in favor of is to make 2 figures that were actually sometimes melting together into one figure, and sometimes in other viewpoints it would mean more openness. You would be able to look right through. Because here this building is so central, and we wanted to have it to a certain civicness, we also thought it should be largely opened. It should also be a building that is positive, so we try to make it a happy building. And a happy building was to also do something that we had not done before, and that is to decorate the building. Because you have to understand that we were trained in offices before, where the brick was something you would use in a very honest way. So the beauty of the clay being heated in an oven would actually provide the beauty of the brick, which is true and which is still valid. But at that time, we didn't have the money to, for example, choose 2 types of bricks to start up making decorations. And then we came to the point where we thought, well, let's then use a slurry cement to actually cover parts of the bricks. And that allows us to have 2 colors of bricks. And then we can start making decorations. Decorations that refer to decorative motifs from the area, which was one of the requirements from the municipality. We have also been looking for bricks that were literally produced in the localities. But then we found out that most of the small brick companies were taken over by Wienerberger. So then we thought, we can choose from a larger amount of bricks, which is not necessarily local. And then we started to use elements like diagonal brick patterns that you can see here. And another important thing was this building being visible from all sides, could not have a backside. So we implemented a grid that would make coherence over the whole facade. So every side would be provided with the same rhythm and proportions of the grid. And within the grid, we would make variations per side. So on the main market square, we would combine the 2 windows into one window. We would open up the complete facade to have a full view inside. And that would give the whole building actually a more grand scale, you could say, while around the corner, it would be smaller again by separating the windows and closing off the arches. As you can see, there's 1/4 of the square is occupied by services and logistics, and there's a stair. So we thought that this would function as a bar. Here would be the bar. You would enter somewhere here. Then you would ask the barkeeper whether you were allowed to go up. And then you would go here, all the way up, step out here, and step in the tower here, and go all the way up. This would be a logical way of also controlling the accessibility. Simultaneously, people were, it was, let's say, semi-public. It took about 2 or 3 years before somebody was really starting a bar in this place. In the meantime, we were all of the time frightened by wild ideas such as a jeans shop. I think there was even a liquor store, which is not so far away from a bar, of course, but in the end it worked out. But it means also that this building, which had the intention to be civic and accessible, was not more than a folly for many years. I would say for at least 3 years after realization. Here you can see what we did with the bricks. So it is actually a complete red brick building, and parts of it are covered with this cement slurry. And this cement slurry has the beautiful capacity to change in color. So when it's very dry, it is a very light appearance. It's more like this part of the brick. And when it, of course, gets wet, it darkens, and the whole building also turns a bit darker. We found these diagonal motifs in the surroundings, and we're convinced that the people, the inhabitants of Nieuwbergen would understand this as a local motif. And we started to use these motifs in several ways. We also implemented a very exotic brick bond, a Brazilian bond, for its openness, for the wind to be able to go through, which is in the tower. We also implemented arches, sometimes more as a symbol or sign, and to emphasize that, we also gave priority to the grid, actually immediately explaining that the arch was not having its original function anymore. When you would go around the corner, the bond would also flip. The dominance of red would change into the dominance of green. And that gave us a different, or yet another tool to make very subtle changes per site in the building, as you can see here. And this is how it was in an empty state. You have to imagine that this would be the most transparent and accessible floor, and that this would be the more quiet floor for gatherings. It's a conference room, so to say. And that is also a bit similar to the typology of these trade buildings, where this was the most dynamic floor, and then this was the more administrative floor. And here you can see that every site is slightly different. For us, this is almost a collage. It's coherent, and simultaneously it's different on every site. And here you can see that sometimes the two towers step away from each other, while on other sides they merge. So you could say we made a house in this small town center. Here you can see the flipping of the masonry bond. And on top of this house there were two towers. And the tower actually has only one function, perhaps not really to provide a scenic view over the environment, which it is actually doing, but it's more like a billboard. It is just a sign which is visible and provides identity to the town. Here you can see some of the churches in the surroundings. It's a steel structure, so the whole base is in situ concrete, which is in the Netherlands very unusual, but that's because of the architect. We didn't want diagonal crosses in front of the windows, so therefore they could not build this also in steel. They then had to make it in concrete. And the inside of the building, of the tower, is also specifically rough, because the outside of the tower needs to play a role, but the inside is the backside of this billboard, you could say. So we kept it deliberately rough, also asking the bricklayers to keep the slurry, the beards there. And even it's on small high heels, so to say. So it is, these are all elements expressing that it's, you could say, not necessarily a very coherent building, that it's something that has been added to it. If you remember the plan, there's also no residence of the tower in the ground plan, although we tried to do this in the beginning. The whole plan evolved, and then we, at a certain point, thought that it would be a better solution to actually disconnect it. So I told you that we introduced a lot of local elements, but the inhabitants of Nieuwbergen saw this as a mosque, which to us was not necessarily a problem, but for them it felt a bit threatening. But I think recently they got a bit more used to the building. We also studied technical things like, if you make a grid, Do you give priority to the column, or do you give priority to the beam, and what to do when you have to go around the corner? And it's actually, I call it a column, but it's a pilaster because it's melted to the wall behind. And how deep can you make such a thing? We did a lot of plaster models to find this out, what the right depth was. We also studied Muzio to see in Milano, to see, and it's just covered by a leaf, but to see how he would go around the corner with bricks, giving priority to the lintel, so to say, to the beam. And he used a very small square brick, vertically placed, something which is impossible to do in the Netherlands because it would freeze out, so to say. It would get wet, and when it would be freezing, it would pop out. So we found a sort of solution of the beam sticking into the pilaster. This is how you would find the building on the market square. Here, the original Newtown building, and this was implemented by the project developer. In the back, and it is white, therefore you cannot clearly see it. There's the town hall, and for us it was very important to make a standalone, not only because of the typology of the trade building, but also we thought we didn't want to be as nostalgic as this is. Also, we didn't want to be as shallow as this architecture is, and also not as wide as and abstract as the town hall is. So we tried to implement a new voice, which was resonating some of the things here and some of the things here, without losing a certain autonomy. Later, we found out that in the graveyard of the city, or of the town, Bergen, the original town, there was this beautiful tower with a lot of different bricks and stone types in one structure. We found it out too late, of course, but it's a beautiful ruin, so perhaps that's a good ambition for our landmark building as well, that it will become eventually a beautiful ruin. The second project is the Atlas House, and I'm going to slightly speed up a bit. The Atlas House is in Eindhoven, which is the town of the electricity company Philips, and this is the old estate of the family of Philips. It's a beautiful privately owned forest, and on the edge of the forest there was a former industrial site, which is then gentrified into a living quarter. And on this small spot, there was a vacant lot, and our clients bought this lot, and they wanted to have a big house on this very small plot, and they had a very small budget. So what we did was we proposed two models, or we're going to make a bungalow type, because if you would like to have a big house and a small budget, oh yeah, I forgot one, a big garden, then and you have a small plot, then you have a sort of problem. So we said if you do a bungalow type and with a garden room, you can live around your garden, or around your patio, like an impluvium, or we make a tower house, a very compact house, which is vertically organized. And then you have a small spot around which you could still use as a garden, and which you could actually provide some privacy, because you have to imagine that the neighbors would be building their houses here. And all of them having big wishes for big houses, the privacy would be something to worry about. During such a process, we make images. These images are idea images, and they also evolve during the process. I have to say, in this case, not a lot, because most of the things also were there, or are there now. I have to tell something else about the position on the plot. We had quite long discussions with our client to turn the project 45 degrees, because we were convinced that you would have more beautiful views out of the windows in a turned variant, longer vistas, so to say, along the existing road, but also along the crowns of the trees in the surroundings. This house is very simple because it needed to be relatively cheap. The construction material is brick from the inside and the outside. It has a repetition of the same plan on every floor, 3 small rooms and 2 bigger rooms. For us, it was important to always be very aware of the crossing, going from one room to the other. We always try to make this a moment, and the middle room contains the staircase, and you could say the variation is in the section. So it's a collection of rooms, and we thought that at this moment the inhabitants want to live on the first floor and work on the ground floor and sleep and rest on the top floor. But this could change over time. We made a distinction in a plinth and a top. I will elaborate later on this a bit longer. And what we try to do is to find a sort of balance, which we found also in, for example, Venetian palaces, where the windows are pushed completely to the edge of the building. What we found attractive about that is that you have a certain massivity in the middle, and that there's a very thin edge as a leftover. Simultaneously, you make faces, different characters for different sides. And like I told before, the variation is in the section. So actually there are no rooms of the same height. So the dining room is 4 meters high, and there's always a jump from being more open towards more intimacy. Here you can see it as well. And we thought that it would be very cheap to use the same material for the inside. Also brick, which was a bit naive. This is the situation in the beginning. So they were one of the first realizing their building there. I will also show you later what happened. Here you can also see that turning the block 45 degrees actually really provides long views along the edge of the forest. And you can also see by pushing the windows to the edge, you get sort of bay windows. And sometimes the windows would form a couple, and sometimes they would ignore each other, and they would not speak to each other. Sometimes you would also find, sometimes you would also find the windows being very close to the floor. But here, for example, the floor is somewhere here, so you would have a sort of protection. Talking about protection, knowing that the plot was very small and the neighbors would be very close, knowing about the wish for a garden, we proposed to also make a roof terrace where you could be naked without any views of your neighbors. And it turned out well. This is the only place where you can be completely private with no people observing you. And you're actually among the crowns of the trees, which is quite beautiful. We take quite a lot of time before we make decisions. I have to say, sometimes that's quite irritating, but we also just want to be sure before we decide something and fix something. So we do quite extensive series of testing. They might look a bit the same. We also have a series of this which looks slightly different. So you could say this is the later part of the design phase, where we start being worried about the motifs and on the facade. And again, you could say we elaborated on the idea of painting the facade, painting the bricks. Something we, of course, there's a whole theoretical side to this, but this beautiful drawing by Sempre shows us how colorful the temples were and how beautifully decorated they were with paint. And if you look at this beautiful building by Venturi, what we like so much about choosing a very, you could say, authentic material, and then it is very effective to change the whole appearance of such a building by adding another layer, a very thin layer of color. And this building so beautifully explains that it could be quite an autonomous form, putting emphasis on one part of the building, ignoring the other layers, for example, like the window or the end of the building here. And there's something more in the Dutch neo-Renaissance tradition, but I think you find it in more places in Europe. You had the bourgeois houses being built out of bricks, red bricks most of the time, and then they were embellished with white accents, making horizontal striping, but also making all kinds of references to classical architecture, like the keystone and rustications, in a very light and decorative way, also not out of very expensive materials, but out of plaster. So it's almost painted on top of the facade. And that's something we took over. So we started with a plinth, and you have to imagine that the size of these bricks is a bit different. It's a double high brick. The normal brick would be about 65 millimeters high, and this is double high. That had to do with also the brick we used for the inside. Because first we were searching for exactly the same material, and then we found out that it was quite hard to find a cheap stone which would actually, or a brick which would also allow us to use that in the interior. But we found a so-called, we found quite a raw constructive brick with the same size. But we started from the outside, and we thought that this should resonate a sort of rustication, while the top of the building would be more light, perhaps even textile-like. And then we started adding elements which reminded us of keystones. But then here you would have a lintel again, and then on top of the lintel you would have a keystone, and sometimes they would escape and form a pattern on themselves. So some of them are, let's say, logical, and some of them are less logical. We spent quite a lot of time on the joints, because I used the word textile, and I think that's also caused by the treatment of the joints. They are slightly bulbing out, as you can see here. And also this layer of paint, we stopped at the edge, so leaving the reliefs of the window uncovered. And the joints are bulbing out and are slightly brushed, giving quite a raw expression, as you can see here. and here. And and our clients are sometimes a bit annoyed by people passing by asking them whether the house is actually finished, and they got used by it now. We did quite a lot of tests to find this type of joint, because it is a layer in itself that we activated to speak, so to say, and it should work on the uncovered brick, but also on the covered brick. Yes, I told you about the central staircase, the room in the middle, so to say, that connects all. That is a staircase which is made out of wood. You go up, and you have to actually give access to a lot of different levels because of this shifting of the floors. And you go up, and you go up, and then you go down again, and then you go up again. So yes, sometimes you have to be inventive to reach the top here. And as you can see here, it's a dark green stair. And this is without the stair. Building being under construction from several sides. And well, to you could say stress the idea of lightness or texture was also a reason for us to slightly bend the cornice. And the people on the building site made a special mold to cut off all the bricks in a beautiful curve, as you can see here. So there are really some difficult parts here. And we were naive, thinking that we would have a very, let's say, cheap interior. But it, of course, made us realize that we had to design and draw all the elements that were visible, which in the end we fully enjoyed, of course. But and our client was also in favor of not covering it, at least for a year. By now they live there, and they have painted some of the walls in the grayish white, which I think is quite beautiful. It works. Here you see the way they have inhabited it for at least a year. And not a lot has changed since then. I think they've painted this wall white and this one wall not white. But here you can see that the height of the dining room, and then the smaller height of the living room. Again, like I told, for us it was important that these parts of the wall would be apparent to make you very aware of crossing the higher room to the lower room. This is a workspace on the ground level. And here you can see what the two windows combined are doing. They actually form a bay window. This is the kitchen. And we were not allowed to be involved in the interior, but these guys, they have taste. They make a copper sink and a beautiful crane here. And by now, the additions are also being realized, so the photographer is going to make new pictures next week. But you can see that these additional elements, you could say, make the building less autonomous. They root the building a bit more. We took a look at the buildings of Joseph Frank, who is actually always making these beautiful, strange, and very elegant and refined steel structures around balconies, but also on the roofs. And the garden is also being designed now, also not by us, by somebody else. And you see the canopy at the front door. And this is what the neighbors are doing. So everybody is in the same tone of color, which is very good. But smooth plasterwork, white villas, that's the wish of every Dutchman living close to the edge of a forest. No, that's a bit silly. That's one of the requirements of the urban plan, to make a light building. Perhaps it's now also a bit more understandable why people might think it's not finished, but we deliberately like, of course, the roughness of the material. Now the last one is the park pavilion. That's a bit of a bigger building. So these two were rather compact. This is a building we designed together with a Dutch firm which is called the Black Dog. It requires a small introduction. In the Netherlands, you have a big national park, which is called the Hoge Veluwe. And in this big national park, it's one of the biggest and oldest national parks. You have a tradition which goes back to, I would say, the Second World War. This was a private-owned estate, and it later became a state-owned park, and now, I would say, 15 years ago, it was independent again. But when it was privately owned, it was owned by the family Kröller-Müller, and they had a large art collection, and therefore they invited architects to make a museum for them. And they also had a big building in, or they had their home in the west of the Netherlands, but they also needed a country house, and therefore they had this hunting lodge designed by Berlage, famous Dutch architect. And I'm telling you these things because it illustrates, I think, the whole context of beautiful nature, but also of culture. So this is the hunting lodge, Hubertus by Berlage. And this is the Kröller-Müller Museum with part of Henry van der Velde and a part by Wim Quist. So it has quite a long tradition of inviting architects to make buildings. There was a competition for a new visitor center, and we won the competition, and we were immediately aware of this, let's say, the heaviness of the past, so to say, or and we also had a client that said this will be the last building we're going to make for the forthcoming 50 years. So it even got heavier, you could say. And our proposal was to take a good look at the country house, at the typology of the country house. So you saw the hunting lodge of Berlage, which in itself reminds us a lot of arts and crafts, you could say, and there are a lot of more motifs in it. In itself, it's quite a symmetrical plan. For me, it has this tendency to make a connection with nature in a bit of a different way than making a building which tries to imitate nature by becoming a mountain, for example, or by becoming a part of the forest. But this is on one hand, it's autonomous, yet simultaneously by its proportions and the windows towards the landscape, there are all kinds of connections to the landscape and to nature, which is an important motive for which was an important motive for us as well. So we studied country houses actually because we thought this would be the most relevant reference. I show you the volume. It is a program for a visitor center containing a park restaurant, a park shop, and 4 conference rooms. It's about 3,000 square meters. It's partially brick, but it's also partially aluminium. We make these visualizations to actually, well, it's a bit of a an image to wish for during the process of design. And these are the references we used. The country houses of Lutjens were very influential because the thing I just explained about Berlage is something we also experienced here. So on one hand, you see a very brutal and monumental pitched roof. But on the other hand, there are a lot of gentle and small-scale elements which make it tangible and understandable as a building. We also took a good look at this small building, which is the Woodland Chapel, designed by Asplund in the Woodland Cemetery in Stockholm. And what is so beautiful about this is that it's such a modest, small building. And simultaneously, when you enter, it has this very monumental element of a sphere, a dome, which is not revealed from the outside. So the whole interior is being dominated, but also carried by this half sphere. And that brought us to this reference. This is the Mack Café in Vienna. It's designed by Lacaton Vasal. That we thought we should actually activate the ceiling as an element to carry the whole interior, because a lot of things will change over time, but the ceiling might be the stable element which stays there for a long period of time. So the contrast between outside and inside, which you could say is nearly a Baroque theme, where there's a complete disconnection from the internal form from the external form, is something that for us was quite experimental, because we had never done it in this way, and we literally tried to do that. So this 3,000 square meter of a building, we tried to make modest, we tried to make small. So we did not make one big pitched roof. No, we divided it into two. We also curved the building slightly to shorten the building perspective from its perspective. The idea is that there's an open place in the park, or in the forest, so to say, that combines a couple of functions. A cycle repair place, a small a museum here, and then the visitor center here along a parking lot. So on one hand, the head of the building needs to speak and needs to be iconic and visible from far away. So it needs to function as a point of orientation, while the other part of the building bends to the south side to a terrace, which is then behaving more informally as a tail of the building. I'm going to show you the plans as well, but personally I think that the section is telling the complete idea of the building. So there's a pulsing there's a pulsing movement, you could say, in the building. So you enter in a low part of the building, which is 3 meters high, and then in the central room of the building, which combines the restaurant and the shop, it's approximately 8 meters high. Then it's low again here, and then you're in a small corridor, which is again low, and then you enter the conference rooms here, which are high again. So it's going from low to high and low to high, which is a beautiful sequence, I think. Here you can see the differences. So every room, in a way, has its own ceiling. And in the beginning of the competition, we thought that this ceiling should tell about the history of the park. But gradually we changed our minds. This project took 7 years, so you have a bit of time to change your mind. These are the plans. So here you find the park shop, here the entrance, and here's the restaurant. This is a big kitchen. Here's a dining room, which can be connected to this restaurant, but also to the conference rooms on top. This is all back of the house, you could say. So a ballroom for the kitchen, and here the offices and storage spaces. A central stair on the opposite of the entrance, a sort of gathering space here for people that enter, need to orientate. So on one hand, it's, you could say, a comfortable, it wants to be a comfortable country house. It wants to, let's say, welcome the visitors in the park. And on the other hand, it's quite a banal building that has to, let's say, be able to resist thousands of people entering there. So it needs to be bully-proof, so to say. Here you see the top floor with the conference rooms and a circulation zone. Now, this is the plan. And this, you could say, is also the public part on the ground floor. This is all back of the house. And our expectations were that these things would actually blur together, so the shop and the restaurant would visually be actually in one space, and we did a lot of efforts to also make it function like that. So the ceiling binds everything together, but also a wooden paneling binds everything together. Then we have a big folded facade, and the folded facade wants to be a colonnade on one hand, but it also wants to, you could say, create pockets of intimacy. So you have the big space here, but then you have smaller rooms here where people can more intimately sit. And then we have a wooden paneling surrounding and binding everything together. We have a central window here, allowing northern light to enter into the shop, which is almost a church window, very monumental. And then on the other hand, we have a fireplace, which is a very literal quote from a country house, where a fireplace takes quite an important position. And then on top, we have a large balcony, which is connected to the different meeting rooms. The meeting rooms are all connected by one large corridor here, and they all have different sizes. This one is a big one, but it can be separated or divided into two by a folding wall. And then every room has its own particular ceiling, and of course with a lot of different positions. Now the folded facade actually allows you to sit out of the wind, out of the sun here outside, and simultaneously when you are inside you sit close to the light and are protected. This is the building. As you can see, the whole back of the house is actually covered with bricks, because the building has to perform on different sides a different scale, but also a complete different story. It needs to be big and iconic on this side, while it can be more simple and utilitarian on this side. We were seeking for one strategy to bind everything together, and that is the lamella structure, which is in brick, but also in aluminium. And it actually covers everything and binds everything together. We chose for materials like aluminium, but also a very light brick. And our client explicitly asked us to make no use of wood, because wood would be a problem in the forest, because it would actually age in quite a dirty way with the proximity of all the trees. So they were very worried about that, and they also had bad experience with that. And then we also chose a very hard brick for that reason, a clinker brick, and to actually avoid polluting. As you can see, when you enter from far away, you see the silhouette of the building, and then the interior announces itself, with the ceiling announces itself in a rather subtle way, and then you turn around the building, and then the building becomes smaller, more intimate, you could say even more communicative. The shop windows show what is inside, and the entrance is announced by a bigger dormer window. And I just showed you the head of the building, and this is the informal tail of the building, close to the terrace. For reasons of coherence, we also tried to bring the material palette very close, so the bricks are very close to the dimensions of the aluminium and the color of the aluminium, and also refer to the sand grounds in the environment. This is, so to say, the backside, a word we never used. We always said it's the forest side, because you have a large balcony here where all the conference rooms have a look out of the window over the logistic area into the forest, so they almost don't see the logistics that take place here during the day. Again, here you see how the bending takes place of the building. The bending shortens the building, I think. This is how it performs in the evening. The joints of the brick are here treated in a very flat way. They are brought very close to the brick itself to actually make it almost perform as one surface, so that the distinction between the joint and the brick would be, I would say, neglective, while in the Atlas house we try to pull them away from each other very far. Here we try to actually bind them together into one element. This is the interior. And of course, when you talk about a country house, we knew that our client was going to also implement certain things. This is also part of the culture of this national park. They have these animals walking there alive, and they also are very proud, and they also want to show these animals in such a way. And we thought that it would also fit a country house. And we also thought that a certain level of coziness should also be part of this, which are normally words that I find quite difficult. But in this case, because it's such a public building, we really needed elements that were quite literal, referring to a country house. Here you can also clearly see how the paneling actually binds the interior together. We developed special chandeliers with light designers, and this is, well, I cannot show it right now, but this is changing over the hour. Like the sun is shining through the crowns of the trees. So it's alive, so to say, the projection on the ceiling. And it can also be changed according to the seasons. As you can see, there are more moments where nature peeps in. And there are also visitors making use of it now. This is the shop. This is a central stair. And also for the interior, we used a quite limited amount of materials. And yeah, there was quite a large discussion because an open fire is not eco-friendly anymore. So the legislation is changing. But still, we wanted to make a big fireplace with special tiles developed for this fireplace. Thank you. This was the last one.